conflict that's happening not just on Moorea, but all over French Polynesia and the world about coastlines and what they're going to be used for. Are they going to belong to the people who've always lived there? Or are they going to be for hotels? Or is it so urgent? Is climate science so urgent that we should just have scientists there setting up field experiments?
What's up, everybody? From Novelist Magazine, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today, we're joined with Nell Freudenberger. She's a novelist and the author most recently of Lost and Wanted. And recently, she wrote a piece for us about the Pacific island Moorea and the tension between the marine conservation scientists there and the indigenous people. Nell, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Brian.
So can you give us a brief sense of your background and how you understand what you're up to as a writer?
Sure. Yeah, I'm mostly a fiction writer, although I do some journalism. And when I was young, I would often pitch a story to a travel magazine if I wanted to do some research, because it's a lot easier to go somewhere and tell someone that you're with Travel and Leisure magazine or with Nautilus magazine and ask them questions about their work than it is to say that you're writing a novel and you want to put them in it. So yeah, that was sort of how I started doing journalism. I worked at the New Yorker magazine when I was really young as an assistant, and I learned a lot there. And then I started writing these articles alongside the books.
And in your novels, you often incorporate or write about the lives of scientists and the problems they deal with too, as well, correct?
I mean, I've only just done that in the most recent book, which was called Lost and Wanted, and it was about physicists. And so I thought I ought to try to meet some physicists and see where they worked. And obviously some work in offices in universities, but some I met an amazing woman who worked in a lab at MIT, and they were working on LIGO, on gravitational wave science. And it was such an exciting time to be doing research about that, because during that time they won the Nobel Prize for the dual detection of a black hole collision. And so that was when I started really interviewing scientists. And I didn't think I would do it again in this book, but I started to read about coral biology, and I was really excited to meet the people who were working at Gump and Creo, and that was what sent me to Moorea. I was really lucky that Nautilus gave me the opportunity to write an article that was a little bit unconventional. You know, sometimes it's hard to write something that's sort of at the intersection of art and science. And even it's sometimes even hard when you're working with an editor to shift a little bit midstream, which is what I think I did when I was working on this piece. I thought it was going to be really a kind of straight science piece about conservation of this incredible coral reef around the island of Moorea. And instead, it became a little bit more about indigenous approaches to science, because it just became clear when I started talking to people that, you know, like everything, this science is political, and the context of the place where it's happening sort of determines how it goes.
So let's linger there for a little bit. Tell us about the island of Moorea and about the coral reefs that initially drew you there, and then how through your process of reporting and researching that shift in the narrative became apparent to you is where you wanted to go.
Yeah, so Moorea is one of the Society Islands in French Polynesia. It's a ferry ride from Tahiti. It just takes about 25 minutes. And obviously it's a huge vacation destination. But before I started reading about it, I didn't understand the colonial history or the connection between tourism and the military there. That the tourism started because the airport was built, I believe that was in 1960 or 61, in order to bring the military infrastructure that was necessary to start the nuclear testing program that happens in the Pacific with Americans in the Marshall Islands, and then also with the French for 30 years. I mean, it's just amazing how long the French government was conducting nuclear tests in French Polynesia, and how and that people there are still fighting to be compensated for uh, the incidence of cancer in those islands, and what happened to the land there. So I really wasn't aware of that when I started reading about coral. And I talked to some really interesting scientists before I got there, who sort of said to me, when you're there, you're going to want to try to speak to as many Tahitian and other local people as possible. You're not going to want to write a story that's just about foreign scientists. And of course, that made sense to me. And then at the same time, I'm also interested in writing about women in science, because when I started researching Lost and Wanted, I was amazed by the lack of parity in university science departments, especially in physics. And so, so I hope that this article is a balance. I was just going there to try to learn, because I'm a complete outsider, not only to science, but also to this place. And so I was just trying to talk to as many people as possible.
Tell us a little bit about the Canadian marine biologists who you traveled with there, and how you just interacted and what you got up to.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't travel there with her. She was there. She lives there for part of the year, and also in British Columbia. Her name is Hannah Stewart, and she is very invested in this place-based program that she has set up for Berkeley undergraduates. And it was wonderful for me. They were incredibly generous, because they hosted me at GUMP, the research station, and I was also allowed to sit in on the classes. I mean, I was there for 8 days, so obviously I wasn't there for the whole program, but these students were doing sort of a deep dive into Polynesian culture and history, as well as biodiversity and data science. And so they were really learning from the people who knew there. They were spending a lot of time with fishers and learning about this really complex issue of marine conservation in Moorea. And then they went to Titiaroa, which is that tiny atoll that Marlon Brando bought after he filmed Mutiny on the Bounty. And there's a super fancy hotel that people have heard of there called the Brando, where Kim Kardashian had her 40th birthday, and Barack Obama wrote one of his books. And I didn't get to see the Brando. I think you have to fly in on a private plane, but the students were able to go there,
Oh, wow.
I think by boat. And they weren't obviously at the hotel. They were on the beach, learning about the biology of atolls, this really unique kind of ecosystem. And so it's just this amazing opportunity for these kids. And I was so impressed by them. It made me think, when my kids grow up, I just want them to apply to Berkeley so they could possibly participate in this program. These kids were I shouldn't say kids, these young people were so open to to learning about the place where they were, and they were so astute, and they corrected a lot of my biases. They kind of kept me honest, and they were really helpful in writing the piece. So I really lucked out in kind of being able to embed myself with them.
Yeah, that sounds like a really unique, comprehensive, holistic approach to marine biology and marine conservation, learning about the culture of the area and communicating with the locals and getting a sense for how the problem has that local context and history sounds really fascinating. What were
Well,
some of the
I think
things
for
that
the complexity, oh, sorry, I was just going to say also, like, the sense of the complexity of the indigenous populations there. Like there's this word Maui that refers to people of Tahitian origin, but it's a fairly new word that was coined in the second half of the 20th century, kind of amidst movements for independence from France. And there are some people there who identify as Maui, but there are also a lot of people who come from other communities nearby and would prefer to be identified that way. So it's really, we use this word indigenous and we feel like it's kind of a catch-all for everyone who is from a place, but it's so complicated where people are from and how they identify. And sometimes even asking Like, for example, with the coral gardeners, I was interested to know how many people working at that organization identified as Indigenous Polynesian. And their answer to me was, well, a lot of these people have grown up on this island and they're Morayan as much as I am, even though they have French parents. And that's certainly not the way that we would define that in the United States today, but to me as a fiction writer, that's so fascinating, the way that people construct their identities, especially as it has to do with place.
Of course, yeah. Tell us a little bit about the coral gardeners. What were they doing there, and what did you learn from that?
Um, yeah, the coral gardeners are great because you can see so much about what they're doing online. They even have a web, like an underwater webcam that shows one of their coral nurseries. So basically, their idea is that they take, and they're not unique in this. There are organizations all over the world that are doing this kind of work. That they take a coral that has resisted bleaching during a bleaching event when the water warms to an unsustainable temperature for coral. I'm sure Nautilus readers know this already, but the coral can sometimes expel its symbionts, so these zooxanthellae that are the little dinoflagellates that live inside the coral, and that's why the coral becomes white, because it's lost these little colorful plants that normally give it its color. And so the coral gardeners will take these corals that they'll call super corals, and they'll say, okay, this one resisted, so there must be something, it must have some kind of ecological advantage, and they break off pieces of it, little nubbins, and then they're regrowing these stronger corals in nurseries around the island and off of Tahiti as well. And they're great with social media and their online presence, so that you can learn a ton about them from everything they put up. And they're also just very cool young people who love what they're doing, and that's pretty inspiring.
Mm-hmm. So what has caused or is causing the tension between scientists interested in marine conservation there and French Polynesia's communities, the people living there, or the people who identify with that place?
I mean, I am so far from an expert about this. I guess I would just say that obviously there's a difference between science and conservation, and so there are scientists there who are working on field studies and studies in the labs at the Gump Research Station and also at the French station Criob. And then there are people who are purely conservationists, like the coral gardeners, who have scientific advisors. And then there are all the people who are from these islands. And I think what I would say is that there are so many competing interests, and I really learned this from the people I got to talk to through the students at Berkeley. There's a really great cultural anthropologist named Jean Wencelius who let me read a paper that hasn't been published yet, that's about all the different competing interests in the lagoon. So there are tourists who want to stay in overwater bungalows. My teenager saw pictures of the place and she said, please, can we go and stay in one of these thatched huts out over the water? And I said no, because it's way too expensive. But the other reason, even if we had all the vacation funds in the world, is that obviously building those bungalows out into the lagoon and over the reef is damaging to the lagoon, and not sustainable in the long run. While I was there, there's a real conflict about there was a zoning issue, and it had been decided in favor of a developer who wants to expand a hotel, as far as I understand, on one of the last public beaches in the island. And there was a protest that had happened before I got there, where activists, including Hinano Murphy, who appears in the article, had sort of staged a peaceful protest on this beach, and they put a sort of sacred pillar into the sand there that it's carved, it's really beautiful, and it has a particular power, that's supposed to be sort of, we say taboo in English, but it's supposed to exert this power that would be really bad fortune for somebody who removed it. And I
Mm.
heard, I mean, this may just be a rumor, but I heard that they're not going to remove it. They'll just build a hotel around it to be careful of that tower. So it's such an interesting, you know, conflict that's happening not just on Moorea, but all over French Polynesia and the world about coastlines and what they're going to be used for. Are they going to belong to the people who've always lived there? Or are they going to be for hotels? Or is it so urgent? Is climate science so urgent that we should just have scientists there setting up field experiments? One of the most interesting things I learned was about what had been going on at these labs during the pandemic. And some of the scientists had kind of taken advantage of the suddenly different conditions. You know, when there weren't tourists, I met one scientist who had set up an experiment with the light under the bungalows. The bungalows are lit underneath at night so that they look spectacular when you're a tourist coming back from dinner or whatever. And so they had used that to measure the effects of artificial light on particular populations of fish. There was another really interesting study about shark feeding, because tourists like to come and feed the sharks, and then you want to have a picture of yourself in the water with sharks or stingrays to show your friends at home. And so there are companies that take people out and they throw. I think there are a lot of regulations about this now, but sometimes in the past people have thrown fish into the water so that the sharks would come, so that the tourists could jump in the water with them or scuba dive with them or swim with them or whatever. And one scientist had the idea of seeing, you know, how long it would take the sharks to stop coming once this sort of artificial food source was there for them. But in fact, the scientists didn't know that the local people who ran the company were still feeding them, because they wanted to make sure that the sharks were still there once the tourists came back. You know, they wanted to get the business rolling again as soon as it was possible to bring tourists back to French Polynesia. So that to me is like just a fascinating interaction between the different needs of different people. And of course, it's a question of like, whose needs are you going to prioritize?
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting. So did you say earlier that this trip and your stay on the island is part of your own research for your next novel?
Yeah, I mean, I started out by just wanting it's a novel that's set mostly in New York where I live, but I wanted there to be a scientist who was very far away. It's set during the pandemic, somebody who seems to have kind of escaped altogether, kind of like those couples that you heard about on internet, you know, those viral internet stories about like the couple who was caught in Bora Bora during the pandemic and just had to stay at the hotel for their honeymoon or whatever. I was interested in what had happened to scientists who were working there, and so I wanted to go and talk to somebody who'd actually been there during the pandemic, and also to just see the lab. I mean, so much of fiction research is sort of simple in a way. You just want to see, what do these rooms look like? What does a lab look like? What does the bedroom that you sleep in if you're living at Criob look like? What does the air smell like? You know, I don't feel like you can get a sense of a place from pictures or even, you know, video on the internet. You kind of have to go. I think the thing that surprised me the most when I was taking the ferry to Moorea was just the phenomenon of the high islands. The idea of these islands that just come dramatically, they just ascend sort of dramatically out of the sea. And they're so green. I mean, what you see pictures of mostly is this turquoise water, and it is really beautiful, but you've seen it on so many postcards and calendars that it still doesn't look real, even when you're looking at it. But these really lush green mountains with all different kind of foliage, to me, that was the kind of surprise and the thing that was the most beautiful about the place.
And those were formed by volcanic activity, right? Is the volcano still
Yeah.
active?
There's not an active volcano on Moorea as far as I know, but I did not talk to anyone about volcanoes, so I can't swear to it. There were definitely no erupting volcanoes while I was there.
Did you meet any scientists who had been stranded there during the pandemic?
I mean, sort of stranded by choice. Yeah, I met I think he was a doctoral student who elected to stay when some of his colleagues went home, because he thought he could get his PhD much faster. And another one of the senior scientists I was talking to there said that in fact he thought that had been a great choice, because he did so much more than he would have been able to do otherwise. And it was also just, you know, a lovely place to be, of course, compared to the places where most of us were.
Right. Do you think you'll find yourself going back there?
I mean, I would love to go, of course. I'd love to take my family. I'd love for my kids to see, to be able to snorkel on those reefs and see what they look like now. I mean, I like to think positively, and I hope that they'll be able to do that when they're adults as well. But yeah, it is scary to think of what repeated bleaching events might do to this reef and other reefs. I read a really interesting article yesterday by a scientist at the University of Alabama who was writing about divergent bleaching responses within even the same species. She was talking about how, a bleaching event where the coral expels those zooxanthellae and becomes white, they might recover one coral might resist it altogether and be fine, and the other one might bleach and then recover. And then 6 months later, they might look exactly alike. But the one that had bleached and then recovered is producing a lot fewer reproductive cells, a lot fewer gametes, because it's used all its energy to recover. And if bleaching events happen, annually, say, it might be really, really hard for those corals to reproduce. So there's, definitely a lot of discouraging news out there, but it was amazing to hear about these indigenous conservation methods that have been, in place since before Europeans came to these islands, and now the efforts to make them work the way that they originally worked, because they were these very sophisticated and quite scientific methods that then, were sort of supplanted in some cases by Western, colonization of the islands.
So, did you learn anything about what scientists might be trying to do to lower the frequency of these bleaching events over time so that they don't become depleted after they spend a lot of energy to recover? Is that part of what the investigation was?
Yeah, I spoke to one scientist, her name's Letitia Edouin, who's at Criob, and she was talking about deeper nurseries for coral. So the idea of, there are really deep reefs. There was one that was they're not really discovered. Tahitians have known about it forever, but there was a really beautiful reef off of Tahiti that got a lot of attention right before I visited, and its health is kind of because it's so deep. I think from 100 to 250 feet underwater. I believe that's right, and that's the mesophotic zone, so the deepest layer of the ocean that light can penetrate. And the coral down there have these huge plates. They have the spreading plates, so they'll call it like a rose coral reef. Because the plates have evolved to kind of capture as much light as possible. And it was just a remarkably healthy reef because it's deeper and the water there is colder. So one thing is, there's a lot of debate about whether planting or artificially growing coral is the way to go. But if you are going to do that, you want to do it as deep as possible because it's less likely to be affected by really warm surface temperatures. But in terms of what scientists can do to keep coral from bleaching, it's not really, scientists really can't do anything to keep the ocean from becoming more acidic or warmer. Obviously, that depends on everyone else and industry and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Right. All right. Now, any closing remarks about this wonderful piece you did? Anything we didn't cover or mention that you want to point out?
I guess it's just that there were so many things that I read that I wasn't able to mention in the piece. But if people are interested in Polynesia or Oceania, as people are calling it now in general, I think the essay called Our Sea of Islands by Apelli Halfa, I hope I'm not massacring that name, is really changed the way that I thought of this island, not a tiny island isolated in a huge ocean, but community that includes the ocean and all these islands. It's one of the largest entities on Earth. So anyway, that essay is called Our Sea of Islands. And there's also some great poems by a poet from, I believe she's from Moorea, actually she's from Tahiti, and her name is Flora Debatine. And her poems are really beautiful. So I guess that's what I would recommend. And I'm supposed to say my website, it's nellfreudenberger.net, and I'm on Twitter as Nell Freudenberger.
All right, you heard. That's where you can find her, and also I'll ask you for links to those resources, and we can put them in the show notes below the video so people can find them easily. Thanks so much for your time, Nell. This was fascinating.
Yeah,
talking to you about this.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thanks to Novelist for letting me write this piece. I'm so grateful.